Today, I'll be walking you through 5 mini JavaScript projects for beginners. Each of these projects will take us about 15 to 20 minutes to complete. They're practical, you'll have a real visual working application, and I'll show you how to integrate JavaScript with a little bit of HTML and CSS. Now, these projects are designed for beginners. However, it will be a good idea to have a little bit of experience with JavaScript. You don't need to be great, but if you know basic syntax like variables, for loops, if statements, that's going to make it a little bit smoother. Also, having a bit of knowledge of HTML and CSS will be helpful, but if you don't, no worries. I will kind of teach you what those features are as we go through the videos. Now, these projects are in order of difficulty. So the first one's going to be the easiest one. It's where I'll go the slowest. And then as we progress through the videos, it'll get a little bit faster and we'll work through some more complex projects. These are super fun, a great way to practice your skills, and I guarantee you're going to learn something new and have some unique projects that you can show off after this video. With that said, let's get to it after this quick break. Now, I don't know about you guys, but personally, I use my phone a lot. I'm always sending emails, Slack, Discord messages, etc., and I'm just in constant communication all day. Now, recently I started using Type AI, which is a keyboard extension that lets you use ChatGPT directly from your keyboard, which means you no longer need to copy and paste across various apps. Now, it's been super helpful, and I'm thankful they sponsored this video so I could share some more of their features with you. With Type AI, of course, you have features like spell check and grammar, but you also get AI autocomplete, wording recommendations, and my personal favorite, the tone changer. Now, this is a downloadable app that's compatible with iOS devices, and it's helped me professionally respond to emails and change my tone based on the context while being super easy to use. What's even crazier is I can just use Type AI to automatically generate responses for me or ask it exactly what I should say. Now, all of this is done directly on your keyboard, which means you can do it from anywhere with zero friction, and there's no more copying and pasting. To start using this on your keyboard, simply click the link in the description to get a free trial of Type AI Premium version. This is a great tool for any of you that type a lot on your phone. So what I'll do now is quickly demo each of the finished projects. If you want to fast forward to one of them, there will be timestamps in the video player as well as in the description. This is the order in which we'll complete them. I recommend if you're a complete beginner, then just go in this order as I'll build upon each project in the next one. Okay, first project, Color Flipper, allows us to simply switch between some different colors for the background of the screen. And if I click on random, we will randomly generate a color. Pretty straightforward, but it's allowing us to see how we connect events to button presses and how we can randomly generate colors and set DOM properties. Next is a Palindrome Checker. A palindrome is something that's spelt the same forwards as backwards. This is actually a very famous algorithm style problem and something you might get asked in a very early stage interview. So a palindrome example is something like dad, because this is spelt the same forward as backwards. So if we type check, it says it is a palindrome. If we do something like madame, right, that's a palindrome because it's same forward backwards. If we do dog, this is not a palindrome. So just a simple check showing you how we can check for a palindrome. Next is a random quote generator. So what this will do is randomly give us a quote on the screen. There's lots of modifications you can make to this, but you'll notice that what I've done is made it so that we're going to go through all of the different quotes that exist before we start cycling back to one of the same ones. This means you're never going to see the same quote once or twice in a row, and you're going to get through all of the unique quotes before you end up seeing a repetitive one. Kind of an interesting feature that makes this a little bit more complicated and an interesting project. Next, we have a timer or a stopwatch. This is going to teach you about set intervals and how to handle timed events in JavaScript and with HTML. So we can, of course, start the stopwatch here. You'll see that it goes up. We can stop it, we can reset it, we can start it again. And this also teaches you how to handle some different edge cases. For example, what happens if I press start when it's already started? Well, in this case, we restart it from the beginning. What happens if I press stop a bunch of times? Well, stay stop. What if I keep resetting it, right? It works. And lastly, we have a persistent to-do list. Now, this is interesting because this will actually allow us to store items in between browser refreshes. Just to quickly demonstrate this to you, you'll notice that if I start the stopwatch here, but then I refresh the page, it's going to go back to the original state. Same with the random quote generator, right? If I refresh, just goes back to the original state. Now, watch what happens with this one. So I'm going to go add item here for hello world. And when I refresh, notice it's still here. So we can do, I don't know, item 2, add this in here, refresh, still here. If I delete one of the items and refresh, it stays here. So I'm going to show you how we can do some persistent storage using local storage in the browser, which is quite interesting. So again, feel free to fast forward to any of these projects. Now we're quickly going to go through the setup, which won't take us very long, and then we'll actually get into coding these out. All right, so I've popped over to Visual Studio Code. Now this is the editor I recommend that you use for working on these different projects, but you can use anything you want. What we need to do here is get in an environment where we're able to write both JavaScript and HTML code, and that's going to be easiest in Visual Studio Code. Now what we'll do is we'll start by creating a folder. So you'll notice I've already made one, but if I delete it, we can just remake it here. So let's go new folder, and I'm just going to call this 1 because this is where we're going to put project number 1. Inside of here, we're going to make 2 files. The first file is going to be our main.html file, and the second one here is going to be our index.js. Now this will be the structure for all of our different projects. So if you're going to do all 5 of them, you can just copy this directory and have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as the various different names. Once we've got these 2 files, I'm just going to show you a really useful extension in VS Code if you're using this editor that I recommend you install. Now this is called the live server. If you go here to the side in the extensions menu, which is this that I've clicked on here, kind of looks like the little puzzle pieces or a square with one of them removed, you'll see live server pops up here as the top result. It's got a bunch of downloads and I've already got it installed. What you'll do here is just click on install. It might make you relaunch VS Code. And I'm going to show you how we utilize this so that we don't have to keep refreshing the page whenever we make a change to our code. That's pretty much all you need. Once you've got that, you're good to go. And we're going to start working in our 2 different files. So at this point, we're going to begin project number 1. Make sure you install that live server extension if you don't already have one. Okay, so we're going to go into our main.html file, and we're going to start by creating kind of the template or the user interface for our application. Now, in case you're unfamiliar, HTML is hypertext markup language, and this is something that allows us to actually create elements that exist on a web page. What's better though is that it allows us to actually interact with JavaScript, or vice versa. JavaScript can interact with the HTML, which means if we say type something into an input box or we click on a button, JavaScript can handle that action for us and allow us to display different things on the screen or kind of determine what's going on. It gives us that dynamic behavior. So to begin our HTML document, there's a little shortcut you can use here in VS Code, which is HTML:5. Now, when you type that, you'll see this autocomplete shows you HTML:5, and if you click on it, it's going to give you this whole template document. Now, if for some reason that's not working, no worries. What you can do is go ahead and pause the video, and you can start typing this out. What we need is the following. We need this tag up here. Let me zoom in a little bit so it's easier to read. That says doc type HTML, and make sure you type it exactly like you see it. So you have the exclamation point, doc type, you have your angle brackets here, and then you have HTML. We specified the language at the top of the page. It's not necessary, but it's good practice to get into. So we do again our angle bracket, HTML, language is equal to EN, standing for English. And then we specify our head tag. Now the head tag is where we put some metadata related to the application. If you're copying this out yourself, you don't need these 2 tags here. You can just leave it like this. So put head, and you'll notice that we have an enclosing tag here that it has this slash. So whenever we're working in HTML, you'll have an opening tag, and then you'll have a closing tag, and that'll denote kind of a section where we can put some different content. So in this case, we put a title tag. So we have our title opening tag and our title closing tag. And this is the title of our web page, which will appear kind of like this in the little heading or the kind of browser tab. So in this case, for project number 1, this is the color flipper. So we're going to name the title color flipper. We're then going to have our body tag. Now it's important that the body tag comes after the head tag. As I said, inside of this head tag here, you have metadata related to the application. Inside of the body tag is where you're going to put the content that will live on the page. Now notice that all of this is happening inside of these HTML tags. So we have an HTML opening tag and an HTML closing tag. Inside we have the head tag, and below that we have the body tag. If we add some indentation, it kind of looks like this. Okay, so just make sure you have this set up here. I know I'm spending a bit of time on this, but I just want to make sure none of you get kind of led astray right at the beginning. So it should look exactly how I have it here. The white spaces don't matter. You just want to make sure it looks just like this. Okay, Now we've got this, it's time to start creating the basic user interface for our application. Now to do that, we're gonna write a few tags here, which will represent physical elements that will exist inside of our HTML document. So what we'll do just to start and just to test things out is we'll create an H3 tag. Now for all these tags, with the exception of ones like the doc type tag, which we don't need to talk about right now, you always have your opening tag and your closing tag. And the closing tag always has a / denoting the end of a section or of an element, okay? So like the body tag has its closing body tag, the H3 tag has its closing H3 tag. Inside of here, we're gonna say color flipper. Okay, now when I save that, we're gonna get a bit of formatting. Don't worry too much about that. What I wanna do now is show you how we actually open this page up so we can see where our code's actually running and what it is that we built. So we have two options here. The first option is we can simply just double click and open our HTML file. So what you'll need to do, depending on your operating system, is you'll need to find the folder this exists in. Now in VS Code, you can simply right click on the file and you can click Reveal in Finder or Show in Explorer. So if you're on Windows, there should be something that says like Show in Explorer or Show Location. And if you click that, it's gonna bring up a file kind of search menu for you here and show you where the file exists. So in this case, if we just double click it, you'll see that it will show up. And if I want, I can zoom in here by hitting Control+ or just by zooming in Google Chrome. And you'll see that we've got our head tag appearing and we have the title, color flipper, kind of showing up here, okay? So I'll exit out of that for now, but that's the first way to open up your code. The second way is to use this live server extension. Once you've installed live server, you should see this go live button down here. So we're gonna go ahead and click on it. And what that will actually do is create a little server for us that's gonna run this HTML file. And now anytime I make any changes, so let me just put this on the side of my screen and go like color flipper 1, as long as I save this main.html file here, very important that you save it, you'll see that it will just automatically adjust. So you can see up here, we're getting color flipper 1 in our title. Okay, so that way we don't have to constantly keep refreshing the page. If you don't have live server, you will need to refresh the page for the updates to appear. Okay, so from this point forward, we can kind of move our screen over a bit so that we can see what we're doing on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand side, we have our code. Okay, so we have color flipper, and then we have our H3 tag here of color flipper. Now again, just a reminder, if you're not seeing any updates here, just make sure you save the file. You can do that by hitting Control+S or by going to File and then hitting Save at the top of the screen. So we're gonna now work inside of our body tag. That's where most of our work's gonna be because that's where we're actually creating the different elements that appear on the screen. For now, what I wanna do is create a few different buttons that are gonna sit here and allow us to click on them essentially to change the background color of the screen. So to make a button, you simply type button like this, and then again, you're gonna have your closing tag. So you have an opening tag and you have a closing tag. Then what you'll do inside of the button is you'll give a kind of name to the button or what you want the text to show as. So to start, I'll start with green. Now when I save that, you'll see that this green button appears. I'll show you how to change the color in a second, but for now, we just have the green button. So now we're gonna copy this and we're gonna have a button, which is gonna be the red button. And we're gonna have another button, which is gonna be the blue button. Okay, we're then gonna add one more button. So we'll copy this down here and we'll call this the random button. Now I'll just make this a little bit smaller and you'll see that now it will fit all on the screen. I just have this zoomed in a lot. For you guys, it'll probably be quite a bit smaller. I'm just zooming it in so you can read it a bit easier. Okay, so now for all of our buttons, what we're gonna wanna do is actually change their background color, right? So rather than like the green button being gray, we want it to be green. So there's a few ways to do this, but the best way is to create some CSS or a kind of styling for this button. So to do that, we're gonna go up in the head tag now. So outside of the body, make sure we're in the head, and we're gonna write a set of style tags. Now the style tags is where we can specify styling properties for different elements in our HTML. Now, before we're able to actually kind of apply a style to these different buttons, we need to give them something to identify them with. Now we can give them a class, we can give them an ID. There's these different identifiers that we can have for HTML elements. Right now we're gonna use an ID and later on we can look at a class. So for our buttons, inside of the button tags here, we're gonna say ID is equal to, and then we're gonna put double quotation marks. And inside the double quotation marks, we're gonna specify the identifier for this button. Now this button is gonna be green. It's important that for all of your IDs, they're unique values and they're enclosed in double quotation marks. You also want to make sure you don't have any spaces or any weird characters like this or brackets, okay? You just want to have kind of a standard string or a standard set of characters. You can have numbers, that's fine, but you just want to have kind of a normal set of characters here, okay? So for the ID, we're going to go with green. And then for this ID, we're going to go with red. And for this ID, we're going to go with blue. So we now have a way to identify our various buttons. Now what we're going to do is go in the style tag and we're going to style them. Now to access what we want to style, we have to specify the identifier. Now the identifier for using an ID is this pound sign. So when I put this pound sign and then I put the ID I want to access, so in this case like green, I'm now accessing any element that has the ID equal to green. So what I'll now do is put a set of curly braces, and inside of these curly braces, I can put any styling properties that I want to apply to this button. So in this case, I can simply say the background color is equal to green. Now when I do that, it's going to change the background color of my button, so it's now green. Now we can go ahead and do the same thing for our other buttons. So we can say red, and then inside of here, we're going to have background color red. Okay, so now we have a red button. Same thing here for our blue button. We're going to say background color, and then blue. Okay, that's awesome. Now, if we want to make our buttons look just a little bit nicer, there's one more thing we can do that will actually apply a style to all of our buttons. So maybe I want to make my buttons a little bit round, want to make them a bit bigger. We can do whatever we want, right? But let's say I want to make them a little bit bigger and rounder. Well, to do that, I can actually just access the tag button, and now any button is going to get this property. So I can say button, and I can put two sets, or I can put a set, of curly braces. And now anything I put in here is going to apply to any of the elements that have this button tag. So here we're using the ID as the identifier. Here we're using the tag name as the identifier. And there's tons of different ones you can use inside of CSS. It's not meant to be a CSS tutorial, but I do want to teach you this. Okay, so for our button, we're going to set a border radius. And by the way, look how many properties there are. You don't need to memorize these, okay? I have a few of them memorized because I've used them before, but you can always just look up the styling properties if you want something unique. So I'm going to go border radius, and we're going to set this to be 5 pixels. When I do that, you'll notice we get some rounding on the corners. That's what border radius does. Next, we can set, say, the width. So I can say the width is 100 pixels. Make sure you have the pixels here. If you don't have the pixels, you're going to get an error. And then I'm going to set the height here of 40 pixels. Okay. Now you'll notice the buttons are a little bit close to each other. So what I can do is apply something known as a margin. The margin is the amount of space between the different elements. And I can say, we're going to have a margin of 5 pixels. And when I do that, notice they kind of get spaced out a little bit nicer here, and they're separated on the screen. Okay. So at this point, we've got pretty much all we need for the actual user interface. What we want to do now is start working with our JavaScript, which is what this tutorial is supposed to be about. So what we're going to do is inside of this index.javascript file, so .js, we're going to link that to the HTML. Now to link this file, we go into our body tag, and at the bottom of the body tag, we specify a script, okay? And make sure, again, you have your closing script tag. And we say that the source for this script, which is src, is equal to index.javascript. Now this works because this index file is directly in the same directory as our HTML file. So we just want to make sure that this file is in the same directory so we can reference it directly. So that means all we have to do here is just write this out. And assuming you have the name spelled correctly, just always double check your naming. It's going to link these files together. So now what we can do is we can start setting up some events so that when we click on the buttons, it does something in the JavaScript, which then modifies the code. So how should we do this? Well, there's a few ways that we could kind of get started here, but the first thing I want to do is access the kind of body component. So I want to access this body element so that I can show you how we change the background color of it programmatically in JavaScript. So to do that, we're going to create a variable. Now there's 2 types of variables in JavaScript that we can create. We can create them using the constant keyword or const. This means it's a variable that's not going to change. We're not going to modify it later on. Or we can use the let or the var keyword. And this is going to create a dynamic variable where its value can change. Now in our case, we're not going to change this variable. So we're going to say const and then body is equal to, and now we're going to use document. Now what document is going to access is the HTML document, and it's going to allow us to reference any element that exists inside of here. So in this case, I want to get the whole HTML document pretty much. So to do that, I'm going to say document.getElement. And then notice that we have a bunch of options here, right? We have by tag name, by class name, etc. We're going to use tag name because we want to get the tag name of the body element. So let me zoom out a little bit here. Okay, so we're going to say const body equals document.getElements by tag name. And then we're going to get the body tag. Now, what this is going to do is give us the body tag itself. However, there's a little thing we need to look at. So what we're doing is saying get elements by tag name. Notice this plural S. Now that means that this is actually going to return to us what's known as an array of the different elements that have this tag name. Because when you're getting a tag name, there could be multiple elements that have, say, the button tag or the paragraph tag or other HTML tags. Now in our case, we're getting the body tag, and we know there's only going to be one of those. However, in order for us to access that tag, we have to actually index it at index 0. The way you can think of this pretty much is that body here, like this variable, so this tag, sorry, is going to return to us a list. And this list is just going to have one element. And that's going to be the body tag we want to access. Now to access the first element in the list, we simply put these square brackets and we put 0. That's the index or the kind of pointer, I don't know what you want to say, identifier of this element, because 0 is always the first element in our list. So now this variable is going to get, well, the first element in our list, which is just the body tag, okay? I know it's a little bit confusing for a completely beginner tutorial, but I'm trying to go nice and slow. So now what we're going to do is we're going to say body.style.background color is equal to, and then we can set this to any color we want. So I could set it to say red. Now when I do that, notice that the whole thing changes, right? The background color changes to red. The reason that happens is because once we've kind of made all these UI elements here, we've linked our script tag. And inside of the script tag, what's happening now is we are getting that body component, that body element that I was talking about. We're then changing the style, and specifically, we're changing the background color to be red. Now we can change anything else we want. There's a bunch of other properties we can modify, but in this case, we just want to do the background color. Okay, so that's working really nicely now. The next thing that we want to do here is we want to make it so that when we click on these buttons, we change the color. So to do that, we're going to make a function. Now a function is just a block of code that we can call that's reusable. So I can say function, this is how you start defining one, and then I can give the function a name. In this case, I'm going to call it setColor. Make sure you don't have any spaces or any weird characters in your name. And then I'm going to give this something known as a parameter. Now, parameter is kind of a unique value that you can pass into the function so that it can do something different based on the value you give it. So now inside of this function, so I have these set of curly braces, by the way, make sure you don't forget this. You got to kind of type it exactly as I have it. What we're going to do is what we just did. We're going to say body.style. And this is going to be background color is equal to, and then name. Now name is going to represent the name of the color that we want to set the background to. So what we've just done is made a function, and when we call this function, we can give it a name, and whatever that name is, we'll set the background color to. So I can simply go here and I can call the function. The way you call the function is you write the name of the function, which is setColor, and then you pass to it any of the parameters that it specifies. In this case, the parameter value is name, so I can just pass it, say green, and when I save it, you'll notice that the background color goes to green. Now the thing is I can call the function multiple times, so I could say red. Now it's going to go to red because first we set it to green, then we immediately set it to red. Now if we want, we can change this and we can set it to blue. We could even go to something like purple, and you get the idea here. We're going to continue to change the background color using this function. So that's great. But the thing is, I want to call this function when I press on these buttons. So how do I do that? Well, I'm going to go to my HTML, and inside of my button tags here, I can actually register an event called onClick. Now what onClick will do is call a JavaScript function when the button is clicked. Now that's great for us because we have our function here that we can call. So we're going to go onClick is equal to, and inside of double quotation marks here, we're going to write the name of our function exactly as we have it in the JavaScript. Now in this case, it's setColor. But remember that we have to pass a parameter, which is the name of the color we want to set. So what we're going to do is put two sets of parentheses here, and make sure you put single quotation marks, okay? The reason we're using single quotation marks is because we have double quotation marks here, which is kind of, what do you call it? giving us the ability to write this function in. Whenever you're working with these properties of these HTML tags, you need to kind of put them inside of double quotation marks. So in our case, we're saying, okay, onClick is equal to double quotation marks. And then inside of here, we're saying set color, but now we need to pass a string value to our function. So in order to do that, we're now going to use single quotation marks so we don't get mixed up with the double quotation marks. So we're just using singles because it does the same thing as doubles, but it allows us to embed them inside of a set of double quotation marks. I know it's a little bit confusing, but please just use double quotation marks here. And then for this one, we're going to say green. Okay. And now what happens is when I click this button, it's going to call this set color function with the parameter green and set the background color to green. So now all we need to do is copy this for all of our different values and change the parameter here to be the according color. So it's going to be red and blue. Okay, so now I can go red, green, blue, and I can set these colors on the screen. And the last thing that's left is to set the random color. Okay, so now to set the random color, we're going to need a different function because we're going to do something different. So we're going to say function random color. And same thing here, we're going to put a set of parentheses, but this time we don't need any parameters. We don't really care. We don't need to pass anything to the function. It's just going to do something when we call it. And inside of here, we're going to generate a random RGB value. Now, RGB stands for red, green, blue. These values go from 0 to 255, okay? And this allows us to create pretty much any color by using a combination of red, green, and blue. If we had 0 red, 0 green, and 0 blue, we'd have black. If we had 255, 255, 255, we have the full red, full green, and full blue, then we would have a white, okay? That's kind of how RGB works. So what we're gonna do is start generating 3 random values, a random amount of red, a random amount of green, and a random amount of blue. So we're going to create a constant variable again, because these don't need to change. We just want to create them so we can store our value. And we're going to say const red, that's the name of our variable, is equal to math with a capital M dot random. And then we're going to multiply this by 255. Now the multiplication operator is simply the asterisk here, which you can find on your keyboard above the 8 if you hold shift. Now what math.random does is it generates a random value for us between 0 to 1. So you get this kind of random, multi-decimal value, like an example is like 0 point, something like this, okay? We now take that and multiply it by 255, and what that ends up giving us is some value that's between 0 and 255. Because if we generate a number between 0 and 1, and then we multiply that by 255, we get a random value in the range of 0 to 255. The issue is that random value is going to be a huge, decimal point value with a bunch of things. So what we need to do is round it off. So we're going to say math.round, and then we're going to put all of this inside of here. What we're actually doing is using the rounding function. We're passing in some random value we generated, and now it's going to round it to a whole number. So we can copy this and paste this and do the same thing for green and for blue. So now we have a random red value, random green value, and random blue value that are all in the range of 0 to 255. Now all we need to do is use those values to create a color that we set the background with. To do that, we're going to do a bit of a string manipulation. So we're going to say const color, again, creating a new variable, and this is going to be equal to, and we're going to use backticks. Now, you may not have seen this symbol before, but if you look at the tilde on your keyboard, which is the squiggly line typically below the escape key, or at least close to there, there's these symbols that kind of look like single quotation marks. They're not. They're called backticks, and you're going to find those on the keyboard, okay? You're going to put a set of backticks, and inside of here, you're going to type RGB. You're going to put a set of parentheses, and we're going to embed the variable red, green, and blue inside of here. Now to do that, we're going to put a $sign and a set of curly braces, and we're going to put red, and then we're going to repeat this for green and blue. Now what we're effectively doing here is creating a color that we'll be able to use to set the background color with. So to do that, we have to have the string RGB, and then we have to have 3 numbers, right? The amount of red, a comma, the amount of green, a comma, and the amount of blue. That all needs to be inside of a string, so we use this kind of neat string manipulation trick with these backticks to embed these number variables, because the data type of these variables is a number, not a string. Strings are in double quotation marks or single quotation marks. Numbers are just values like 67 or 255. and we embed them here inside of this variable. Now that we have the color, we can simply say body.style.background color. And rather than using the name of our color, we can use this RGB value. So we can say color like that. And now when we call the random color function, so let's do it down here, you'll see that we get a random color. So every time I save, you'll see we get a unique random color because it keeps refreshing the screen for us. Or every time you refresh, you'll get a different random color. So now what we need to do is make it so when we press this random button, it does that. So all we have to do here is for the random button, we just go on click is equal to random color. Make sure you put your set of parentheses here to call the function. And when we call random, we get a random color on the screen. So that's going to wrap up project number 1. I know there was a lot of explanation there, but I just want to make sure for the first one, at least, I'm kind of teaching you all of the core concepts. Now we'll start to pick up the pace just a little bit as we head into project number 2. All right, we're moving on to project number 2, which, as you might recall, is a palindrome checker. So we're just going to check if a string is the same forward as it is backwards. Okay. How do we do this? Well, let's begin by creating our files. So we're going to have our main.html file, and we're going to have our index.js file. Now, I've already done this for project 1, so if you're confused at all, go back to project 1. I'm going to go a little bit faster now than I was before. So again, if it's too much, go back and watch project number 1. We're going to start by typing HTML:5, and then we get our autocomplete. If that doesn't work for you, go to project 1, and you can just copy the HTML, and you can remove what you don't need, or you can pause the video and you can type this out. You don't need these. You can remove those from the screen. I'm going to zoom in a bit so it's a little bit easier to read. Okay, so now we're just going to change the title of our document. So rather than having this, we're going to have Palindrome Checker. And for the interface for this one, it's going to be quite simple. We just want to have a title that says Palindrome Checker. And then we want to have the ability for someone to type into a little box and then to press a button to check their string. So we're going to start inside of our body by having an h1 tag, and we'll just say Palindrome Checker like that. And what we can do if we like here is we can rerun the live server, which will give us access to view this code as we're writing it. So what you'll notice here is that if you look at the bottom right-hand side of the screen, you'll see this thing that says port 5500. If that doesn't work, you can also just type live server. The way I open this, by the way, I know I went a bit faster, is I hit Control, Shift, and the character P on my keyboard. This opens the command palette in VS Code. So it's either Command Shift P or Control Shift P, depending on your operating system. And then I typed live server. When you do that, you'll see you have open with live server and stop live server. So first I'm going to stop the live server because I had that running before. So you saw that stopped it. I also could have just pressed the button down here. And now if I click on go live, or again, I have Control Shift P and then I go live server and then open with live server, it's going to open up that HTML document, which you saw right here. So what we'll do is we'll just leave this on the right-hand side of our screen. We'll move this over to the left so that we can kind of see what we are doing as we write the code. Now let's make this a little bit smaller so that we can actually see the full title. Okay, so now we have our title. The next thing we want to do is create an input box as well as a button for the user to type in. So in order to get an input box in HTML, you simply type input. Now this is what's known as a self-enclosing tag, meaning you can simply type a / and the closing angle bracket like this. You don't need to type like /input like we had before. In fact, that won't work if you do that. And here for the input, we're going to specify the type of the input, which is going to be text. And we can give this a placeholder and we can say type something. Okay, let's make this a little bit smaller. So now you'll see a little input box pops up here and I can type inside of this. That's the basic HTML tag. You can also use this for numbers, dates, all kinds of stuff. Now, as well as the input button or input box, sorry, we just want to have a button that you can click on. So we're going to say button. And then for the button, this is going to say check. You'll notice a button appears. And now nothing's happening because we don't have this linked up, but you could click on the button. Okay, lastly, we're going to link this to our HTML or to our JavaScript, sorry. To do that, we're going to create a script tag at the very bottom of the body of our HTML document. Then we're going to say source is equal to index.js. Again, recognizing that this only works because the index.js file is inside the same directory as our main.html file. Okay, so make sure you have that set up. All right, now we're just going to give an ID to our input. The reason for that is I need a way to actually get what the user typed into the input box. There's some other ways to do it, but the cleanest way is to simply give this an identifier. So we're going to say ID is equal to, you can call this whatever you want, but I will just call this the input, okay? Again, don't use any special characters, just use kind of a normal string like this. Okay, so that's pretty much it for our HTML. We've got our very simple interface here. And now what we want to do is start writing in our JavaScript. So let's open up our JavaScript file and we'll do the rest of the work from here, other than a few small things we'll add in the HTML. Okay, first thing we need to do is figure out how we can get what the user has typed in this box. Because before I can check if it's a palindrome, well, I need to know what it is that they typed, right? So to do that, we're going to say const input. We're declaring a constant variable, one that's not going to change. And this is going to be equal to document.get element by ID. Now, what this allows us to do is get one element by its identifier, right? Which is the ID that we set. Now, in this case, the ID is input. So what I do is I put input inside of double quotation marks. Just to quickly show you, we have ID equals input. If it was input 1, we would go here and we would change this to input 1, okay? I know it's confusing because I did the same thing, but just it's the ID, okay? It's not the name of the tag, it's the ID. We're doing it differently this time than we did in the first project. Okay, so now we've got the element. When we have the element, it gives us access to this whole input box. So we could change the styling, we could clear what's inside of it. We can also get what's inside of it, but that's not what this does. This just gives us the whole tag or the whole element itself. And then if we want to get the value, that's different. So let's write a function here called check, okay? And inside of this function, all we're gonna do is we're just gonna output what the value is. So to do that, we'll say const value is equal to input dot, you guessed it, value. Now you might notice that I'm putting these semicolons. You don't need them in JavaScript, but they're what's known as a line terminator. This just means we're ending the current line and then moving to the next one. Again, you don't need them, like it's fine if you don't have them, but if you see me add one, it's just out of habit. Anyways, what this does is give us the value of the text input. So now if I'd like, I can use something known as an alert. An alert is a message that will pop up in the browser, and I can simply alert the value. So now all we need to do is make it so that when we hit check here, we call this function and it will tell us what the value is. So to do that, we go to our button here and we say on click is equal to check with two sets of parentheses. Okay, or sorry, one set of parentheses because we have the opening and we have the closing. So now when we click this button, it calls the check function. The check function gets the value of the text input and pops it up on the screen. Let's test it with test. Click on this and notice it shows us in the alert box test. Okay, so now we know how to get the value. Now what we need to do is figure out how to determine if this is a palindrome. Now recall that a palindrome is simply something spelt the same forwards as backwards. So if we have dad, that's a palindrome. If we have dog, not a palindrome, okay? So how do we check this? Well, there's a bunch of ways, and I challenge you at this point, if you know some basic JavaScript, try to see if you can figure this out, but I'm gonna walk you through it now. The easiest way to do this is for us to simply reverse the string and then just compare it to the original string and see if they're the same. So what I mean by that is, okay, we have the string dad, so let's now reverse it. Well, that gives us dad. We're gonna check if they're the same. They are the same, so they're a palindrome. Whereas if we have something like dog and we reverse this, we're gonna get God. Well, these are not the same, okay? So it's not a palindrome. So now we gotta figure out, okay, how do we reverse string? Now I'm gonna show you a fancy way to do this, and then we can go through a manual method as well. So I'm gonna write a function called reverse string. Now this is gonna have the parameter str. This is a value that will give us input to the function. A function is simply a reusable block of code that you can call as many times as you want. So what we're gonna do is we are going to first take this string. So a string is anything, again, in double or single quotation marks, and we're gonna convert this into a list or to an array. Now an array is a collection of elements that are ordered. So we can have an array that has the values like this. Okay. Now the way you access the elements in an array are by using its position or its index. The first position in the array is always the 0th index. We always start counting at 0 in programming. So here, this is position 0 or index 0. This is index 1, index 2, let's go here, index 3 and index 4, okay? Now, the interesting thing with arrays is there's all kinds of what's known as methods, which are essentially operations or functions that we can call on the array that can manipulate them. So what we can do is we can take our string, which is a different type, right? It's just a set of text, essentially. We can convert it into an array. We can then reverse the array, and then we can take the array and turn it back into a string. It's not the most optimal way to do this, but it is a way that we can kind of do this in a single line, and I'm going to show you those operations. So what we can do is we can say return str dot split. Now what dot split does is it takes a string, again, anything in double or single quotation marks, and it splits it based on what's known as the delimiter, which is the value that we specify here. Now, oftentimes you would use this split operation to take a string and maybe get all of the words that exist. To do that, you would have a delimiter of a space, and that means that we're going to look for all of the spaces, and as soon as we see one, we're going to take whatever's on the left side and whatever's on the right side, and we're going to add those as unique elements into an array. So if we were to split on hello world and we used the delimiter of a space, it would give us hello and world in an array. So now we have all of the words like that are in a sentence, right? Now, if we split on an empty string, all that means is take every single character and put it into an array. So in the case where we have hello, it just turns that into an array that has those 5 characters. So we're going to split. Now, after we split, we're going to reverse. Now notice I'm using this dot notation. You can use this on certain data types, and it's like calling a function on that thing. So we're calling split on the string. Then we take all of this and we call reverse on it. So we're now reversing the array. Now that we've reversed the array, that's going to give us the reversed array. So in the case of dog, right, that would give us G, O, and D. And what we want to do is we want to compare this to the original input. But remember, the original input is simply the string dog, right, in this example that I'm using. So what we need to do is we need to now take this array, and we got to convert this into the string version of it that looks like this. How do we do that? Well, there's another method we can use, which is .join. And what .join does is it takes all of the different elements that are in our array, and it combines them together into a string with a separator or a delimiter. Now, in this case, if we use the empty string delimiter, we just get all of the characters smushed together. Join is kind of the opposite thing of splitting, right? It's taking the array elements and turning it into a string, whereas splitting is taking the string elements and turning it into an array. If I were to join with a space, then we would get this. But when I join with the empty string, we just get the string. Okay, so that was my long explanation of how these methods work. Again, I'm trying to be really thorough, especially with the beginner projects. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. Okay, so we have reverse string, so now we can reverse a string. So now let's just do a test, and let's say, okay, const reverse is equal to reverse string of value. All right, so what we're doing now is we're calling the reverse string function. We're passing in the original value. We're now returning a reversed version of that. So now let's simply alert reverse. Okay, now let's go here and go hello. And notice we get the reversed version. Now I need to make sure I remove the space here because you can see it's kind of spaced out. So let's run this again. Again, every time when I save this, it's going to automatically update. So just make sure you're saving it, and you see we get it reversed, okay? So now that we have it reversed, we're just going to check if it's the same as the original. So to do that, we're going to make an if statement. An if statement allows us to check a condition. A condition is something that evaluates to true or to false. And the way that we can do this condition is we can say value equals equals, so 2 equal signs to reverse. Now it's actually best practice to do 3 equal signs. I don't really want to get into all of that in this second, but either 2 or 3 equal signs doesn't matter for this example. And what this will do is it will compare these 2 values for equality. It's going to check, are these the same? That's what happens when you use multiple equal signs. Don't think you can use like 4 or 5 equal signs. It's just 2 or 3. They have different meanings, but in our instance, they'll do the same thing. So we're going to use 3 here. We're going to say if value is triple equal to reverse, then inside of a set of curly braces, we're going to alert. I will say Palindrome like that. Okay, I'm just making it a little bit excessive. So that's if this is the case, then we go inside of these curly braces and we do this. We have an alert. Otherwise, which is where this else statement comes in. So we're going to put an else, and we're going to put a set of curly braces. We're going to alert, and we're going to say not today, exclamation point. Okay, so that's it. This is a basic check. If statement, again, you have some condition. In this case, we're checking if these things are the same. This is going to give us either the true or false value. If they're the same, it's going to give us true. And if this thing is true, we do this. Otherwise, we do this, right? That's all how this works. So if I go here now and I type dog, we get not today. But if I type madame, I get palindrome, okay? So now the thing is, you might be noticed, when I click this, it keeps this input here. I don't really want that. It's going to be a little bit better if I actually remove this input after I press this button. So I can do that by simply going here and saying input. Remember, that's this variable here. Dot value is equal to an empty string. So rather than getting the value, we're actually setting the value here. So I'm setting the value to an empty string. So now you'll notice if I type hello and I click on check, it says not today, and then it gets removed, right? We changed the value to be nothing. This is just clearing the value from the input field. Okay, so I think that's pretty clear. That's gonna wrap up this video, or this project. Now let's move on to the next one. So now we are moving on to project number 3, which is our random quote generator. Let me first stop the live server here. So this is gonna stop, and let's make a new folder here called 3. And let's go in here and make our files. So main.html and index.js. I'm going to go a little bit faster. Again, we're just going to progressively pick up the pace. If you're getting confused, go back to the previous project because that's where I really break it down in more detail. Okay, so for main.html, we have a random quote generator. We're going to begin by setting up our HTML document. So we can type HTML:5 and hit enter. Let's remove this so we can view it more. Again, if that doesn't work for you, then you can simply pause the video and type this out, or you can go and copy some of the other projects. Also, this code will be available on GitHub in case you want to copy it. You don't need this, so you can remove that if you want, although you can also keep it. And for the title, we're going to change this to be the random quote generator. Now I'm going to copy this and we're going to create a header tag here inside of our body. So we're going to say h1 random quote generator. And now we just need to simply make the interface. Now for the interface, we're simply going to have a paragraph tag, which is this p tag just for some standard text. We're going to say the ID is the quote, just so we have a way to identify this tag. And this is where we're actually going to put what the random quote is. So when we generate it from JavaScript, we're going to populate this paragraph tag with it. Now we're going to create a button. Now for this button, we're just going to say generate quote. And inside of the button properties, we're going to say on click is equal to, and we're going to call a function called generate quote with our double parentheses like this. Again, if it's confusing, please go back to the other videos. I already explained how all of this stuff works. Now we haven't yet written this function in JavaScript. We're going to write it in a second. So now all we need to do for this interface is we need to make our script tag. So we're going to say script at the bottom of the body, make sure it's at the bottom. Source is equal to index.js, keeping in mind this only works because index.js is in the same directory as our main file. Okay, that's the HTML. Let's go live again this time. And now you can see that we have this generate quote, random quote generator. When we click this, nothing happens. That's fine. Okay. Quick thing, by the way, at this point, I guess I'll show you that if you're on Chrome, if you right click and click inspect, it's going to bring open this kind of developer view. If you click on console, you can see any errors that might be happening. So if you're getting some issues, you can see in the console what's going wrong. I should have showed that earlier, but I guess we didn't have any mistakes yet. So if I refresh, you see it gets cleared. And now if I press this button, it's telling us, oh, uncaught reference error because we haven't defined this function. Okay, just wanted to quickly show that to you. Anyways, let's now go into index.js. We're pretty much done with the HTML. And let's write our random quote generator. So first things first, we need some quotes. Now I'm just going to copy in a bunch of these. You guys can kind of find your own quotes. You can write them, or you can just stop and you can write these out, or you can go to the link in the description. There'll be a GitHub link where this finished project code is, and you can just download all of these quotes or kind of copy and paste the text and paste it in. Just to get started, if you want to just test this, you can just have quotes that are like 1, 2, 3, whatever, okay? Something super simple. Now what we're doing is we're putting this inside of an array. Now remember, I was talking about an array in the previous project where this is an ordered collection of elements where each one of these quotes here, even though they're quite long, they have an index or a number that allows us to access them. So this is index 0, this is index 1, this is index 2, index 3, index 4, etc. And that's how we'll grab our different quotes from our kind of collection of quotes here. So what I'm going to do is create a new data structure that we haven't seen yet with a variable called used indexes. Now this is going to be equal to a new, we're going to use this new keyword, which I'll discuss in a second, set. Now let's quickly discuss a set. So a set in JavaScript is a unique collection of elements. Now the set typically is denoted with the curly braces, although in JavaScript it doesn't really have that type of notation. And inside the set, you can only have values that are unique. So I could have like 1, 3, 4, but I can't have 2 ones, okay? You just have a single instance. So the set doesn't keep track of order. It doesn't keep track of quantity. It just tells you if you have something or if you don't have something. So we know, okay, yeah, 4 exists in the set, and we know that 5 does not exist in the set. That's all a set is used for. Now you might be saying, well, Tim, can't I just use an array for that with all these elements? You can, but the thing with a set is it's actually more performant. So it's a faster data structure when all you care about is if an element exists or if it doesn't exist. In our case, when we're going to be generating these quotes, what we're going to do is we're going to put the index of quotes that we've already used inside of the set so that we can check really quickly if we've already used that quote or not. So that way we don't recycle the same quotes until we've gone through all of them. That's what makes this project a little bit more complex. We're introducing this set. Now in this case, I use this new keyword. Now you have to use this with some certain data structures in Python. Essentially what we're doing here is we're creating a new instance of the set class. You don't have to worry about all that terminology. It doesn't matter that much for a beginner, but it's just a bit different than creating something like an array where you can just define it like this. Okay, so for the set and for some other data structures, you need to actually use the new keyword. So I'm saying, okay, we're making a new set. All right, that's it. So now we have the two variables, quotes and sets. What we want to do now is we want to populate the paragraph tag with a quote. So we'll begin by simply randomly picking a quote. And then we'll start using this set to make sure that we're not recycling the same quotes. So we're going to say function generates quote. Okay. Now inside of here, the first thing we've got to do is we've got to get access to that paragraph tag. So this one right here, so that we can set its value. Now what I'll do is I'll create another variable here. And I'll say const, and this can be quote tag is equal to document dot get element by ID. And the ID of this, I believe, is simply quote. We can go back and reference that. And you see, yes, it is quote. Okay, so what we're doing is we're just grabbing access to that paragraph tag. Right now, you don't see it because there's no text in it, but when we start using it, it will be. And I'm actually just going to call this quote element, so it's a little bit more clear. Okay, inside of here, if we want to set the text of this paragraph tag, we can simply say quote element dot, and we have a few options. But the option I'm going to use here is inner HTML with all capitals for HTML. What this does is set what's in between the opening and the closing tag. You can use this on other tags as well, but for us, we'll just use inner HTML, and we can just make this equal to like hello world for now, just to test it out. So when I press this now, you should see that hello world appears in the tag. If I refresh and press it again, you see that we're populating the inside of the HTML of that paragraph tag with hello world. Okay, so that's kind of what we're going to use to actually set the quote. So now what we've got to do is we've got to randomly pick an index inside of our quotes array, select that quote, and then populate it inside of the paragraph tag. Now we've already kind of done this, but let's do it again. We're going to say const random idx is equal to math dot floor. And then inside of here, we're going to say math dot random, and we're going to multiply this by the quotes dot length. Okay, so we just used a few new pieces of syntax. Let's quickly talk about this. Math dot random, as we saw before, randomly generates a value between 0 and 1. Now, what we're doing is we're multiplying that by the length of our quotes. So you can use this dot length property. It tells you how many elements are inside of the array. And that's going to give us now a random value that's between 0 and whatever the length of the quotes are. In this case, I think we have like 10 quotes or 9 quotes or something like that. Okay, now what I'm doing is I'm saying math.floor. Now what floor will do is always round down. The reason I'm always going to round down is because the length of the quotes is actually going to be one index beyond what we can access. So let's say here, I don't know how many this actually is, but let's say we have 10 quotes, okay? If we have 10 quotes, this last quote has an index of 9, right? Not 10, 9. So if I try to access quotes at index 10, we're going to get an error. It's going to tell us that this index doesn't exist. So what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, well, we'll generate a random number between, and this is going to be 0 and 1, and multiply it by the quotes.length. The thing is, it's never going to actually be 1. The most it will be is like 0.9999999, whatever, right? So when we take that and we multiply it by quotes.length, we might end up getting something like 9.9999999, okay? If that's the case, we simply take that value and we round it down to 9, and now we're getting the last quote, as opposed to if we were just to round it, it would round up to 10, and then we'd be trying to access an index that doesn't exist, okay? So that's why I'm using floor. There's also a seal that will round it up. Also, not sure if you guys can hear the supercar behind me, but I'm currently in Dubai, and that has proven to be a bit of an issue, that there's too many Ferraris and Lamborghinis driving around. So kind of a fun fact, but yeah, that's where I'm recording. And if you heard that, well, there you go. Sorry, not much I can do about it. Okay, so we have random index. Now that we have the random index, we're gonna use that to get one of our quotes, okay? So to do that, we're gonna say const quote is equal to, and this is gonna be quotes, and this is going to be at index random index, okay? So we've generated a random index. We've now used that to access the quote in our array. And can you guess what's next? Well, we're going to populate the paragraph tag. So we're going to say the quote element dot inner HTML is equal to the quote. Okay, so now let's run this, and it starts giving us random quotes. However, you'll see that sometimes we'll get the same quotes and like pretty close together because we don't have that other component that we're going to implement now. Okay, so let's make this a little bit larger. All right, now what we want to do is we want to make sure we're not using the same quotes. So to do that, we're going to keep generating a new random quote or a new random index until we haven't yet used that. So to do that, we're going to make a while loop, and we're going to say while true. Okay, and then we're inside of curly braces here. We're going to take all of this and we're going to paste it here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to generate this random index, and we're first going to check and make sure that we haven't used it yet. So we're going to go here and we're going to say if the used indexes dot has, okay? So this is how you check if the set has a value. We're going to say if it has the random index that we just generated, then what we're going to do is use this continue keyword. Now notice that I didn't actually have to write the, parentheses here, or these curly braces. The reason for that is because if you only have one thing you want to do with an if statement, you can just write it directly to the right or directly below the if state definition. You might not have known that in JavaScript, but it's kind of a nice shorthand syntax. Anyways, what I'm saying is, okay, if the used indexes has this random index, it means we've used this quote before. So we're just going to continue. And what continue will do is simply bring us to the top of this loop. Now this loop is going to continue looping while this condition is true. So I say while true, so while this is true, it's always going to be true. We keep going through here. And then if this is the case, we're going to continue. So it's just going to bring us up to the top of this loop. Now you might be asking, well, doesn't that mean we're never going to exit the loop? Well, as of right now, yes. However, I'm going to show you how we can do that. So if we are in a position where this does not have the random index, what will happen is we won't continue, which means we're going to continue down to these lines. Kind of a weird way to say that, but we'll essentially advance to these lines if this condition is not true, which then means down here, I can say break. And what break will do is break me out of this while loop. So as soon as the break keyword is encountered, you simply go to wherever the while loop is finished and you just continue there. That's all that does, okay? So it just gets you out of the loop. If you have while true, you're going to need a break to make sure you don't have an infinite loop. Now, the last thing we need to remember to do is to add the index we used to that set so we keep track of it. So we're going to say used indexes dot add, and we are going to add the random index. So what that's now doing is adding that to the set and telling us, okay, next time you try to generate a random index, don't use this one because we just used it before. All right, we're almost finished. There's one more thing, but I want to just show you that this is working. So if we run through here, it's still functioning. However, if we do this enough times, you're going to see that we will actually get an error and no more quotes will be generated. Notice no more generated. The reason why that's happening is because we've run out of quotes that we can pick from. And right now, the browser, if I refresh, you'll see it's actually in an infinite loop. So I need to close this out. The reason it's in an infinite loop is because of something we implemented that I'm going to fix for us in a second. So let's just go live again, and we'll see if we can figure out what's going wrong here. Okay, so let's have a look at this code. And before I kind of answer the question here, try to ask yourself or try to figure out, let's zoom out a bit. Why did I just get that error where my browser was kind of frozen? Like it wasn't generating any more quotes. Pause the video if you want to try to figure it out. I'm going to go into the answer now. So you'll notice what happens here is we have this while loop. We say, while true, we generate this random index. We then check, okay, well, does it exist inside of the set? If it does exist, we're just going to try again. So we could be trying quite a few times, but eventually we're going to get an index that does not exist in the set, right? So then what happens is we will advance down here and we're going to grab the quote, set it, and then add it to the set. Now at some point in time, what will happen is we will have exhausted all of the available indexes and we will have used all of them. So what will then continue happening is we're going to be in this while loop. We're going to try to generate a random value. We'll do that, but no matter which one we generate, it's always going to be inside of the set, which means we're just going to continue doing this portion right here a ton, right? That's what's going to happen. So how do we avoid that? Well, the way we avoid that is right here, before we go in the while loop, we make sure we do actually have a quote that we can pick from. So to do that, we can say if the used indexes dot size. For a set, you use size. For an array, you use length. We're going to say if that's greater than or equal to the quotes dot length. What that tells me is that we've used all of the quotes, right? If the number of elements, which are all unique, inside of the used indexes is equal to the length of my quotes, that means we've used all of them. So what do we do? Well, we simply reset and we say used indexes dot clear. Now dot clear will simply remove all of the values from the set, which now kind of sets this back at the beginning state and allows us to continually keep generating new quotes, but now kind of right back from the beginning. So now all of the quotes are available and we go through the exact same thing again. Once we use all of them, then we can start to recycle them. So this way you're only ever going to see the same quote in the number of quotes, which is equal to the number of quotes that exist here. I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but that's kind of how this works. So now if we start generating them, you'll see that we're never going to get the same quote until we've exhausted all of them, and then we'll get a random one, and then same thing, we won't get the same quote again until we've used all the other ones that exist. All right, so there you go. That is the random quote generator, getting a little bit more complex, but hopefully you guys were able to handle that. Let me know what you think and if you have any feedback for me, and let's move on to project number 4. All right, we're continuing. Project number 4. Let's make a directory, and let's make our 2 files, main.html and index.js. Now, for HTML, you already know the drill. If you watched the previous projects, we're going to go a bit faster. HTML:5. That is going to create for us this kind of template HTML file. You do not need these two. If for some reason that shortcut does not work, you can simply type out what I have here. Let me zoom in a little bit. Let's set the document title. This is going to be our timer/stopwatch. It's actually really more of a stopwatch, so let's call it a stopwatch. Okay, and inside of our body tag, let's give an h3 that says stopwatch. And now let's run our live server. We're going to dispose of the old one, and we're going to rerun this new one. And you're going to see that stopwatch appears in our browser. Okay, so we have got the basic setup. What we're going to do for the stopwatch is we're going to have some functionality that allows us to start, stop, and reset a timer that will appear on our screen. Now, I just want to be clear, I'm going, again, a bit faster in this one. If it's too fast for you or too complicated, go back and watch some of the previous projects because I'm much slower in project 1, 2, and 3. But as we go through, I assume you've watched those or you're already experienced enough that I don't need to explain like the really, really basic stuff. Okay, so now that we have stopwatch, what I need to do is start setting up the user interface. Now for the interface, we are going to have something that shows us the time. And then we're going to have 3 buttons, start, stop, and reset. So let's begin with the time. I'm going to put this in an H1 tag. We're going to give this an ID of time. And we're going to start with 0000, okay? So this is just showing us the minutes and seconds. We can do with hours if we want, but for now, we'll just do minutes, seconds, and you'll see how you can adjust this to go as long as you want. Now we're going to have our buttons. For our buttons, we're going to have onClick. For our onClick, we're going to call a few functions, which we'll then write in the JavaScript, which will handle when we press these buttons, essentially. So right now, they're not written yet, but we'll write them in a second. So the first one's going to be start clock. And then inside of the button, we're going to have start. Okay, let's copy this and paste it twice and just adjust these now to be stop and reset. Okay, so now rather than start clock, it's going to be stop clock. And rather than start clock, it's going to be reset clock. Okay, so we've got 3 different functions that we're going to need to write: start, stop, reset. Now we need to link our JavaScript. So we're going to say script source is equal to index.javascript. And that's all we need. That is our HTML. So now you see we have start, stop, and reset. We have our 00, we have our stopwatch heading. And now we can go into index.js and we can do the fun stuff, which is the JavaScript. Okay. So for our JavaScript, we need those functions. So let's start by stubbing those functions out. When I say stub, that just means you write the function, but you don't actually write the logic for it, okay? So we're gonna say function start clock. We're gonna say function stop clock. We're gonna say function reset clock. Okay, so now we have our 3 functions that we're gonna need to write in a second. Now, before we go any further, there's a few variables that we're going to need here, and I'll talk about how we'll actually do this timing component, which involves using something known as a set interval. Now, first, we need to keep track of how many seconds have elapsed, okay? So we're just going to track how many seconds have elapsed since we started the clock. And then if we stop the clock, we'll just stop counting the seconds pretty much. And if we reset, we'll reset them, right? Otherwise, we'll just keep adding 1 to it every second, which will allow us to, well, have a stopwatch. So let's begin by having our variable, and we're going to call this seconds elapsed, okay? Now this is going to be equal to 0, because when we start the clock, well, 0 seconds have been elapsed, and until you start it, well, 0 seconds have elapsed, right? We're then going to have something known as the interval. Now, for now, we're going to set this equal to null, which just means we're kind of defining a variable, and we're saying, okay, we're going to change this later, but for now, we're going to make it null. Null just kind of means nothing, empty, right? Undefined. I mean, it's a different value, but in this case, null is fine, okay? So we're saying second elapsed, and notice we're using let. When we use let, that means that we can actually change this value later on, as opposed to if we had const, then we wouldn't be able to change it. Okay, now we're gonna grab the actual time kind of paragraph tag here, or header tag, so that we're able to modify it later. So we're gonna say const time is equal to document.get element by ID. The ID of this was time, and this is okay to be a constant because this doesn't change, just what's inside of it will change. Nice. So now what we need to do is figure out, well, what are we doing when we're starting the clock, stopping the clock, etc. So to start the clock, we'll go in here and we'll start writing this. We need to create an interval. Now an interval is something that can run at any predefined kind of period of time. So every second, every 2 seconds, every hour, every 10 minutes, whatever you want. Okay, you can specify the time in milliseconds, which I'll show you. And what it will do is call a function whenever that increment hits. So every 1,000 milliseconds or 1 second, we will increment the clock, right? So we'll say second elapsed plus equals 1. So to do this, we're going to say interval is equal to set interval. This is a function that's built into JavaScript, so you can just write set interval. And then what we do is we call a function, which we'll write here in a second, and we put the number of milliseconds that we want to call this function in between. So in this case, I'm putting 1,000, and now we need a function to call. So we're going to make a function. We're going to say function timer like this. Okay. And inside of timer, all we're going to do is say second elapsed plus plus. Now plus plus simply means add 1. That's all it means. It's equivalent to plus equal 1. It's equivalent to this equals second elapsed plus 1. Okay, so we have second elapsed plus plus, and now what we do is we put timer, just the name of the function. Notice I don't call the function. I just put the name of the function here as the first argument to the set interval function. So what's going to happen now is when we start the clock, we're going to set this variable interval to be equal to the set interval, which calls this timer function every 1000 milliseconds, or every second. The thing is, if I do this now, if I refresh and I run and I click start, you'll notice that nothing's actually happening because we're not updating this. So what we need to do now is we need to update this every time we change the value of our timer, or of the second elapsed, okay? So to do that, we're gonna make another function, and we're gonna call this set time. Now the set time function is simply gonna be responsible for telling us how many seconds have elapsed and updating this value right here. So all we can do in here, just to keep this super simple for now, is we'll say time.innerHTML. So let's go here, is equal to, and then this is just gonna be time, okay? Or sorry, not time, this is gonna be seconds elapsed. And now inside of the timer, after we increment the seconds, we're gonna call the set time function. So what happens now is, okay, we have the interval, every second we call timer, it adds 1 to the number of seconds, we then call set time, time goes here, and it then changes this text to be equal to the number of seconds. You're gonna see what happens, but let's run this out. And you'll notice that it starts simply counting up, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. However, what will happen if we let this run long enough, it's gonna start giving us 61, 62, 63. And it doesn't really look like that kind of stopwatch we're looking for. We want it to be in that hour or in that minute second notation. And also these buttons obviously don't work. And when I click start again, you'll notice it starts counting even faster because we now have multiple intervals that are running. So we gotta fix all of that. I'm gonna show you how that works. Okay, so first things first, let's make it so that when we adjust this, it actually looks proper. How do we do that? Well, we need to determine, first of all, based on how many seconds have elapsed, how many minutes have elapsed, and then how many seconds have elapsed. So to determine the number of minutes, we simply need to take the number of seconds, we need to divide it by 60, and we gotta figure out the even division of that, right? So we don't want something like 2.3, we just want 2 minutes, and then the remainder we'll have as our seconds. So we're gonna say const minutes is equal to, and this is gonna be second elapsed divided by 60. However, again, we don't wanna have a decimal value, which we're gonna get, right? So we want to put math.floor. Now, we're not rounding, we're flooring, meaning we're going down to the nearest whole number, because even if we have something like 1.99999 minutes, we don't actually have 1.99 minutes, we have 1 minute and 59 seconds, right? Or whatever the remainder value is, which is what we'll calculate next. So we always round down. So next we're gonna have const seconds. Now, the number of seconds is simply equal to the second elapsed mod 60. Now, the modulus operator is the remainder operator. This is the percent sign. What this will do is give you the remainder after division by 60. So if we had something like 61 mod 60, it gives us 1. 62 mod 60 gives us 2. 59 mod 60 gives us 59, because you cannot divide 59 by 60 evenly, so you get 59 as the remainder, okay? So now we have the number of minutes and the number of seconds. What we need to do is format this into a nicely padded string that will appear here. So right now, naively, you might say, okay, well, Tim, I remember you showed me this backtick trick. If you look at the tilde on your keyboard, which is the squiggly line, it should be on the same key as that. Backticks kind of look like single quotation marks, but they aren't. They're typically in the top left-hand corner of your keyboard. What you can do is put a $sign and then 2 curly braces like this, or an open and closing one. And you can put minutes, colon, and then we can do the same thing here with seconds, okay? So we do minute, colon, seconds. And what this is gonna do now is take these numeric values and embed them inside of a string with a colon separating them when we call this set time function. So now we're not quite done, but watch what happens. If I click start, you'll see we get 01, 02, 03. Again, still doesn't look great. We need that leading and trailing 0, which I'm gonna show you how to get, but this is a decent start. And now again, if we were to have this go up to 60, you'd see that it would start showing us the minutes. Now to prove that, let's just make this 61. And let's go with start. And then notice you get 1 minute, 3 seconds, 1 minute, 4 seconds, etc. Okay, let's make that back to 0. All right, now that we've got this, we've got to pad our values. So padding the values simply means, okay, well, we're gonna look at the values, and if they're not 2 digits, then we're just gonna add a leading 0, right? So if it's less than 9, pretty much, add a leading 0. We can do this in a function, so I didn't mean to do that, but I'm gonna say function pad start. This takes in a value. And what we're gonna do is actually return something from this function. This just means we get a value back when we call it. So we're gonna say return. We're gonna take our number, because that's what's gonna be passed inside of here, and we're gonna convert this to a string. When we convert it to the string, that allows us to use this method called pad start. And for pad start, we specify how many characters we would like the string to be. In this case, I would like the string to be 2 characters. So I put 2, and then we put the character we would like to pad the string with. So now what happens is we take the numeric value, convert it to a string, and we pad it with a leading 0 if it is not 2 digits long. Hopefully that makes sense. So now for minutes and seconds, we can simply just call these with pad start. And that's going to return to us a string that has those padded zeros. So we're going to say pad start like that. So we're taking this as a value, passing this into the function. It's then returning to us a value that we will embed inside of here in the string. So if we go ahead and we can refresh this and we start, you'll see now that we get a stopwatch that's a little bit more familiar and what we're actually looking for. Now, the next thing we should look at this point is what happens when you press start multiple times, because you'll notice if I click it, it's just counting up really, really fast because it keeps making these new set intervals. Now, that's not what we want. What we would like to do instead is essentially clear the previous interval if we click start again, and we want to also reset the timer. So what we'll do is we'll say, okay, well, if we had this clock, right? So if we've already started it, so we're going to say if interval, then we're just going to reset the clock and we'll write the reset clock function. So sorry, let me just scroll down here. What I'm doing is I'm checking before I make this new interval. I say, okay, well, if the interval exists, reset the clock. Resetting the clock should reset everything for us. And then we will just redefine the interval here. Okay, that's pretty much all it's doing. Inside of the reset clock, what we're going to do is we're going to stop the clock. We're going to set the seconds elapsed equal to 0. And then we're going to set the time just so that it shows us 0, 0 again. And then inside of the stop clock, we're going to say clear interval, and we're going to clear this interval. Now I have some chaining of functions. That's actually intentional because I want to show that to you in this project. It's a bit of a learning thing, but you can see that what I'm doing again, if the interval, reset the clock. So now we go to this function. Inside of this function, when we reset the clock, the first thing we got to do is stop the clock. So when I click stop the clock, I clear the interval. Now when I clear the interval, all that does is just stop counting, okay? It doesn't change what's like being appeared here. It just stops making this go up by 1 every time. So that's what stopping does. Now after I stop, I now reset the second elapsed to be 0. So that's resetting the clock value. And then I set the time. And the reason I set the time is so that we see that we've actually reset the clock back to 0, okay? Because if you don't call this, you're not going to see the update on the screen because that's what's updating the screen. So now if we just press stop clock, it doesn't actually show us anything different on the screen, right? It still stays at like 7 or 8 seconds or whatever's appearing. It just cleared the interval, which now means if we start the timer again, it doesn't reset, it just starts to count. So let's look at this. If I click start, it starts counting. If I click stop, doesn't reset, just stops counting. I click start, then it starts counting from the beginning. Now, actually, that gives me reason to want to do something else. So let's remove inside of start clock, if interval reset clock. And instead of that, for start, let's actually just clear the interval. So we can actually say, how do I want to do this here? Yeah, I'll say if interval stop clock, and then I'll just make the interval again. Now, I know this seems a little bit weird. I'm going to explain this, but this is actually something I just caught while I was doing it. So I'm starting, okay. I'm stopping, and when I start, it starts counting again. Okay, so the reason I did what I just did there is I don't want when I click start for it to reset and then start counting. I just want it to resume what it's at, and I only want the reset button to reset it back. So what I did instead is I said, okay, well, if an interval already exists, let's remove that interval. So we're saying clear interval, and then we'll just set it again. That way we never have like 2, 3, 4, 5 intervals going at the same time. We've just removed the previous one, and then we've reset it. So we've just kind of continued it on. That's what I'm doing when I'm start the clock. So whether I'm starting at 0 or whether I'm starting with an interval already, it doesn't matter, right? We just keep counting. So if you press start when it's already started, then it just keeps going. Now, when I click on stop, again, it's going to stop. If I click on start, it will start. I click reset, brings me back to 0. I can start and I can reset while I'm started. And you guys get the idea, okay? So that is the stopwatch. Hopefully that was clear. All of this code will be available from GitHub. Now let's move on to the last project. So let us now move on to project number 5. Now this is the most advanced project by far. I'd probably classify this more an intermediate project, but if you've made it through all the other ones, then this one is kind of a natural stepping stone. So I think you'll still be able to follow along with it quite fine. I just want to be clear that I'm going to go again even faster. So make sure you watch the other projects if you haven't, because anything I explained there, I'm not really going to recover here. So let's begin by making a folder for project 5. And inside of here, let's call this main.html. And let's make another file. And this will be index.javascript. So I've got two files, main.html, index.js. We're going to set up our HTML boilerplate at this point. I think you've heard me say this many times, so I don't need to repeat myself. Just get the HTML up and running. For the name, we are going to call this the to-do list. Remember, this is the persistent to-do list, which will remember the items that we had. We're going to stop the live server from our previous project, and we're going to restart it for this one, which will open a blank browser tab. Now, inside of our body, we're going to link our script. We'll just do this first, and we'll say source is equal to index.js to get that sorted out. We're going to have a h1 tag. This is going to be the to-do list. We're then going to have an h2 tag, and this is going to be the items list. So for the to-do list, we have two components. We have something that specifies all of the items in the list, and then we have kind of a place where we're able to actually add the item, right? So for our items, we're going to create a div. Div stands for division, and it's something where we can actually just place items inside of. So I can take all my items and kind of render them inside of this div. So we're going to say ID is items. So we're able to access that. And we're going to create a very basic input so that someone can add an item. So we're just going to say input like that. Remember, this is a self-enclosing tag. You don't need the separate closing tag. The ID is going to be the item input. The type is going to be the text, and the placeholder is going to be to add an item. Okay, save that. It should appear on the screen. Next, we're going to make a button, and the button is going to say add item. And then for the on click, we're going to call the function add item like that. Okay, that is all of our HTML. Zoom out so you can see all of it. Again, we have our header, we have the h2 tag for the items, we have the div. This is where we're actually going to render all of the dynamic items. So when we do something like hello and we click add item, it's going to appear inside of the items list. Okay, then we have the input so that we can add the item, and the button, obviously, which will take that and add it to the screen. So now let's go to our JavaScript and let's start. So let's start, first of all, understanding what it is that we need to do and then writing this out. This is going to be a little bit longer, so it's worth having a bit of a plan for what we want to do here. So what we need to understand, first of all, is that we want to store these items persistently. That means that we need to have the ability to, well, store them. We also need to have the ability to load them. Now, one thing to consider is that we're going to probably have an array of items, right? This is the order in which we have our individual items. We're going to have the ability to remove items, and we need to show the reflection of our items on the screen. So when we first load them all, we got to render them on the screen. It means we've got to actually put them there. And then when we remove them, we got to remove the correct item and then kind of re-render them onto the screen. So there's a few things we got to do, right? We got to save items, we got to load items, we got to render items, and we have to add and we have to remove items. So what we can do is start writing out some of the core function names so that we know those operations and we can tackle them one at a time. So we're going to say let items is equal to an empty array. We'll get into some other things in a second, but for now we understand that we're going to have items inside of an array. We now know we also need to load items, so we'll write a simple function so that we remember that that's something we need to do. We also know we need to render the items onto the screen, so we'll write a function for that. We know that we need to save the items, so let's do that. And we know we need to remove and add. So we're going to say function add item and function remove item. Okay, so that's kind of that. The first thing I think makes sense for us to do is to figure out how to display an item on the screen Once we know how to display an item, then it's a little bit easier for us to understand loading, saving, adding, removing, etc. But we need to say, okay, well, let's say we had some items in here, right, that we wrote ourselves. How do we show them on the screen dynamically? Because we might have one item, might have 5 items. We don't know. We're going to have to kind of loop over all of them and show them on the screen. So for render items, what we need to do first of all is understand where do we want to put the items? Well, I want to put them inside of this div. So I need to access that div. So we're going to say const items div is equal to document.getElementById, and this is items. Now let's just take this and put this on the top of the screen, and let's start writing our render items function. So inside of render items, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to clear this div to make sure that any other items that were in there I get rid of, because I'm just going to re-add them in. So kind of every time I'm rewriting all of the items, it's not the most optimal thing in the world, but it's totally fine for this example. So I'm going to say items div dot inner HTML is equal to null. And all that's doing is just removing everything that's inside of the items div. So now we've got a fresh slate and we can start adding our items. Now what I want to do is I want to loop through all of my items. So if I have one item, I want to add one item. If I have 10, I want to add 10, right? I want to loop over them and I want to create what that item is going to look like and then put that inside of the div. So we start with a for loop, and a for loop is what you use when you know the number of times that you want to iterate. A while loop is what you use when you don't know the number of times you want to iterate. So in this case, we know the number of times it's equal to the number of items. So I'm going to say constant, and inside of square brackets, I'm going to say IDX, which stands for index, and item of object.entries. I'm going to explain this, don't worry. And then items, and I'm going to put a set of square brackets. Now what this does is it will take all of these items. It will essentially give us pairings. Now the pairings are going to look like this. 0, item 1. 1, item 2. What that means is that the index here is going to be equal to the index corresponding with the item, which will be stored in this item variable. So when you kind of do this object.entries here and you pass an array, it just allows you to loop through and to access both the index and the item at the same time, which is what we want. There's other ways to do this, but I wanted to show you this kind of neat syntax in case you haven't seen it. Now what I want to do here is, for now, we're just going to create some text, and this text will just be whatever the item actually is, and we'll just add that inside of the div. But later, we're actually going to add another div inside of the div that's going to contain the text content as well as a button. Okay, so let's look at how we do this. We're going to start by saying const text is equal to document.createElement. Now we can create an element in JavaScript and then put that on the DOM. The DOM is essentially just the interface that you see over here. And by the way, oh yeah, the to-do list is already appearing. Okay, so that's good. So we're going to create this element P. Now we have this element though, that's like, it doesn't really have anything. It doesn't have any text, it doesn't have any styling. So what we're going to do is we're going to set the content. So we're going to say text.textContent is equal to the item. Okay, so now we've created a paragraph tag. We've set the text content, and now what we want to do is add it into this div. So to do that, we say the items div dot append child, and then we just simply add the text. So what this does is it creates the text element, and then it just adds it inside of the div as a child, so we can keep adding different text elements. Now we'll use the other components of this later, but for now I just want you to see how this works. So I'm going to go hello world 1, 2, 3. I'm just going to call this function, and you'll see when I save that we get 2 items appearing inside of our div. Okay, so that's great. That's how we dynamically render items. Now the thing is, I want to actually render some more complex elements here because I want each item to have a button that says remove. So I need to kind of add inside of here not just the text, but also the button. In order for me to do that though, I need to have those inside of one element that I add to the div. So what I really want is something that looks like this, where I have a div that has a paragraph tag, and then I have a button like this, right, that says remove. So I need to create this programmatically and then add this whole thing, this whole div as a child inside of the items div. It also gives me some more flexibility with styling, which we'll see in a second. So we'll keep the text tag, but before we make the text tag, we have to make like a container that's going to be storing all of this stuff that we want to put on the screen. So I'm going to say const container is equal to document.create element, and we're going to create a div. Then we're going to say the container.style.margin bottom. This just means we're going to add a bit of space at the bottom, is going to be equal to 10 pixels as a string, just that I separate these different containers a little bit. If you don't have this, you'll see they'll get really squished together. So we make our container, we make our text. Now we want to make our button. So we're going to say const button is equal to document.create element. We're going to create a button. And now for the button, we're going to say button.text content is equal to delete. Okay. And now we want to set the on click for the button. Now the on click for the button is going to call this remove item function, which is going to remove the item from our list. However, in order to remove the item from the list, we need to know the position in the list where the item exists. So that's why we will have access to this index. So what we're going to do is for remove item, we're just going to specify that we want to take the index of the item that we want to remove. And that now means that when we want to call this function, we need to pass the index. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say button.onClick is equal to, and then what I'm wanting to do here is I want to call the remove item function, and I want to pass the index of this specific element. It's very important that we have the index because we're dynamically rendering different elements. So for each one of these elements, we need to have something that identifies where it is on the screen, right? Or what position in the list it is, so we don't delete the wrong element. So that's why we're passing the index here to this function. The problem with this is when we see this line here, JavaScript will actually call this function for us. It's different than inside of here. So notice here when I have the onClick, I actually write the call, right? Which is the parentheses. In this case, this only actually gets called when we click the button. Here, as soon as JavaScript encounters this statement, so even if the button has not been clicked, it calls this function which will automatically delete the item, which we don't want. So what we need to do instead is wrap this in a function that then calls this function. A little bit complicated, hence why I left this for the last project. We're going to use this arrow function notation. So what we do is we put a set of parentheses, we put this arrow, which is the equal sign, and then the angle bracket, and then we call remove item. Now what this essentially is doing is wrapping the call to this function in another function. So it's a bit difficult for me to explain this entirely, but what we're essentially doing is we're saying, okay, we're going to have a function that calls this function. So that means this whole thing here, right? When we call this, so if I were to do this, this is actually valid syntax, by the way, but if I did this, then it calls this function, which in turn calls this function. So the point of me doing that is that now when we have the onClick event, it calls this function, which then calls this function, so that we don't call this before we actually want to be calling it. I know it's a little bit confusing. I'm hoping it's clear. You guys can let me know in the comments if you have any questions about this kind of wrapper syntax, but this is a unique thing you should know about and that you're actually going to use quite a bit in JavaScript. Okay, so that removes the item for us. Now what we want to do is we want to take the button and take the text and we want to add that into the container, and then we add the container into the div. So we say container.append child, and we're going to append the text, and then we're going to say container.append child. Okay, and then we're going to append the button if I can type this correctly. And then rather than appending the text here, we're going to append the container into the div. So now let's refresh. And I guess we're getting some kind of error. Oh no, we just didn't call this function. So let's call render items. And you'll see now that we get our containers that contain the item and the button. Now, when we press the button, it doesn't do anything, but that's fine. You get the idea. Okay, so that's render items. Now, the thing is, we want this delete to be appearing to the right side or to the left side. We don't want it below. So in order to fix that, we're going to use a display property on our text. Now, you may not be aware of this, but every element in HTML is either a block or an inline element. A block element means that it will actually take up its own row inside of the document, and any element you put after it's going to be on the next row. So in this case, paragraph tags, p tags, are block elements, meaning that anything you render after them goes on the next line by default. Same with header tags, right? These are block elements, whereas something like an input tag or a div or a span, these are inline elements, okay? Which means anything you add just goes in the same row inline. Now we can actually change the display type of elements with their style property. So I can say text.style.display. And if I change this to inline and we actually call render items, you'll see now that our delete goes after the text. Now it's not ideal because there's no spacing. I'll show you how we add that in a second, but you can see that I've changed it from inline, whereas before it was block. If we change it back to block, then we get what you saw before. So kind of an interesting thing you might not have known about. Now what we'll also just do here is we'll say text.style.margin right, and we'll just make this equal to 10 pixels. So we just add a bit of spacing between this and the button. We also, of course, could put the buttons on the left side if we want them to be lined up vertically. There's a bunch of things you could do here, but in this case, this is totally fine. Okay, so there you go. We have now everything we need to render our items. So now that we have the ability to render the items, we want to be able to add them and to delete them. Now, actually, let's start with delete because we already kind of have that hooked up. So to remove an item, all we have to do is remove it from the list or from the array, and then just re-render the items on the screen. So to do that, we say items.splice. Now, splice will simply remove an element at a specific index. So what I can do is say splice idx and then 1. Now what this is saying is, okay, well, what element do you want to remove? I want to remove the element that exists at this particular index. And then 1 is saying, how many elements do you want to remove from this index? We just want to remove 1, okay? So you can see it says start and then the delete count. So we're deleting 1 element and we're doing it at this index. You could delete multiple if you want. So that's how you remove an item from the array. Now, what we're doing after this is updating the screen by rendering the items. So if we refresh this now and I click on delete, you can see we delete that item. Let's refresh, delete 1, 2, 3, we delete that item. Okay, so it deletes the correct item. Obviously, this is not being persistently saved, but we're gonna get to that in a second. Okay, so we've now removed. Now we want the ability to add. So let's get rid of the already existing items here. And for render items, we can now remove that and we can just do that when we add an item. So to add an item, we want to get whatever is inside of this input box and we just want to add it as an item. So we're again going to go to the top of our program. We're going to say const the input is equal to document.getElementById. This is going to be the input item input. What did I call this? Let's see, item input. Okay, so let's change this back to be item input. Okay, and now what we're gonna do for add item is we're gonna get the value of that. So we're gonna say const value is equal to the input dot value. What we're now gonna do is add that. So we're gonna say, first of all, if not value. So if you didn't give us any value, we're not gonna add an empty string to the list. So we'll just say alert. And then this is going to say you cannot add an empty item. And then we can just return. So when we return early from the function, we no longer will execute any lines beneath it. So this is called a naked return. Some people don't like it, but in JavaScript, it's fine. And this is essentially saying, okay, as soon as you hit this, just get out of the function. We don't need to give any value back, but we're just going to exit the function as soon as this keyword is encountered. Then down here, we're going to say items.push, and we're going to push the value, which is whatever they typed into the input field. And we're going to re-render the items by calling the render items function. Then lastly, we're going to say the input.value is equal to an empty string, so we clear whatever they had typed. So let's go here and let's add item 1. And you can see it gets added. We can add item 2, and you can see that I can delete the items as I did before. If I refresh though, of course they go away. Okay, so now we need the ability to save the items and to load the items, and then we are pretty much done. So what we're going to do here is use something known as local storage. So just to give you a bit of a primer on local storage, this is essentially storage inside of your browser. So it's stored on your computer, and a bunch of websites will use this to keep track of information that can make it more convenient for you as a user. Now, you should never store any sensitive data in local storage because it can be accessed by pretty much anyone that's utilizing the computer. And there is ways that you can store data on the server side, but in our case, we're going to be storing it on the client side, which is user facing, right? It's what you're using. So we're just going to store all of the items that you had, and then we'll reload those every time you open up this website again, okay? Now, when we use local storage, we can't store anything. We can only store specific values. So we can store like strings, numbers, etc. In our case, we have a list or an array. So what we're gonna actually have to do is convert that into a string. And then once it's a string, we're able to store it. So we're just gonna go into save items, and I'm just gonna write this out and then I can kind of walk you through it. So what we're going to do is say const string items is equal to JSON in all capitals dot stringify, and we're going to stringify the items array. So it just means we're converting it to a string, okay? So we're just taking the list, converting it to a string. Now that it's a string, what we can do is we can store it in local storage. So we can say local storage, which is the built-in variable that you can write, dot set item. And we're going to set an item, which is equal to a variable I'm going to define here. So I'm going to say const storage key is equal to, and then this is essentially what you're going to use to access the storage that you're using. So you can set as many keys as you want. You just make them unique. So I'm going to make a key called items. And I'm saying, okay, well, I'm going to set the key, which is the storage key. In this case, it's items. And I'm going to make it equal to the string items. Now, what this will also do is it will override any key that already existed. So if I already had something in local storage called items, I'm going to change what its value was to be this new value so that I'm always keeping the most up-to-date version of my items. Okay. Now, in terms of loading items, you kind of just do the same thing, but in reverse. So we're going to say const old items is equal to local storage. This time it's going to be dot get item. And now what item are we getting? Well, we're getting whatever the item is associated with the storage key. However, this is a string. So what I need to do now is convert this into an array that I can then use in JavaScript. So I'm going to say, first of all, if we actually have anything, because it's possible that we don't have any items stored. So if I do have some items stored, which is what I'm checking here, then I'm going to say that my items, which is this variable right here, is equal to, and this is going to be JSON.parse, and then old items. Now what .parse is going to do is it's going to read through this and it's going to convert it to a JavaScript object. In this case, the JavaScript object is an array. It could be an object, it could be a different type, but it's just going to be an array, okay? So it's going to give us an array that contains all of the different items from that string that we put in the storage. Then we're simply going to render the items. So what we want to do now is we just want to call load items as soon as the document has loaded, so that as soon as we kind of open up this website, we load the items, and then we'll call save items anytime we do something different to the item. So we can actually do that first. We'll go down here and we'll say save items. So we're going to save items after we add an item, and we're going to save items after we remove an item. So if we remove or add, the only two operations we can perform on the items, then we're just going to save it, okay? Now though, we want to call load items. So we're going to say document.add event listener, and the listener is going to be the DOM content loaded, okay? And then we're going to say load items. Now, let me just explain what I did because this might be a little bit confusing. So what we're doing here is we're adding an event listener to our HTML document, and we can listen for different types of events. In this case, the type of event we're listening for is the DOM content loaded, which means it's actually loaded all of the HTML onto the screen. As soon as it does that, we're going to call the load items function. So again, we don't actually call it, we just put the name of the function, and then this will automatically call it for us. Now you'll see that I have two items popping up because I already had them stored in local storage for this exact project. But we can delete them, and when I delete them now and I refresh, like, it'll be persistent, okay? So that's it. This is the finished project, and I just want to show you it works. So we'll say hello world, we'll add that. Before, if we were to refresh, it would have gone away because it wasn't being persisted. But now it's being persisted, right? So if I refresh, it's still there. If I delete it and now I refresh, we get the updated version. So I just wanted to quickly show you how to use local storage. There's a lot more you can learn about it, but the basics is you can assign a string key to some kind of value. In this case, we're using a string, and that's how we can store our different items, and we can retrieve them whenever we rerun this code. So that's pretty much it for this project. All of this code will be available from the link in the description in case it's a bit confusing or you want to reference it. I realize that this is a bit beyond a beginner project, but it is project 5, the most difficult one. So I wanted to give you something a little bit more advanced. If you like JavaScript, definitely let me know in the comments down below. I do have an entire course. It's with Course Careers that teaches JavaScript, Go, and a ton of other advanced programming features with the goal of helping you land a job. We've had a lot of success there. If you guys want to check it out, you can do that from the link in the description or techwithtim.net/dev. If you guys enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next one.